Hello, scholars. Mr. Long signing on today. Today we're going to be looking at reform and culture. So we're going to be focusing on a variety of reform movements that are going to sweep across the United States in the first half of the 19th century. In particular, we're going to be focusing at the time period roughly between 1830s and the American Civil War. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we get started, you mentioned do have a lot of slides to get through. I'm going to try to speak as briefly and concisely as possible. So if you need to pause any of the slides to make sure that you get the notes I have written down, please be sure to do so. So use that pause button as you see fit. So starting the era of reform, we're going to have the Second Great Awakening. We already talked about the First Great Awakening during colonization. Second Great Awakening, it's just a sequel. Ultimately, this is a revival of religious fervor that's going to spread across the United States. It's going to bring people into religion. There's going to be multiple conversions. It's going to break apart and reorganize churches. It's going to also create different religious sects based off of denominations that are going to lose members to these new sects. The Second Great Awakening is also going to help fuel several of the reform movements that we're going to be looking at today. First one we're going to take a look at is education reform. For the most part of American history up until this point, so up until right around the 1830s or so, the idea of a tax-funded primary school was pretty rare in the United States. It was pretty rare in the early republic. The tax-funded public schools were seen mostly as the poor. If you were a individual of means, instead of sending your kids to a public school, you send them to a private school to prepare them to go off to, Harvard or Yale or any of the more renowned institutions of higher learning. Well-to-do conservative Americans did not want to educate other folks as brats. This is in regards to them paying their taxes and then their taxpayer dollars going to fund public schools. Over time, the image of what the public schools are meant to do starts to evolve. It's going merely as, hey, you're teaching someone else's brat how to read, to this is going to benefit democracy by creating a more educated voting bloc among, at this time, young white males. And that if they're literate, if they're educated, if they can critically think, they could be more reliable voters for a stable democracy and less of a knuckle-dragging mob, as many of the founding fathers were concerned about. Early teachers were ill-trained, ill-tempered, and ill-paid, and reform was urgently needed to bring these very early public schools up to speed. The Second Great Awakening is also going to lead to multiple denominational schools, smaller denominational schools. For example, my alma mater, St. Vincent College, a screen banner in front of or behind me. It's founded in 1846, so St. Vincent College itself in Pennsylvania can trace its roots back to this era of the Second Great Awakening. Most of these small, typically liberal arts colleges were fairly weak academically. They didn't have a lot of reputation, but it did provide a source of pride for the local communities that housed these schools. Higher education for women. This is still a pretty misogynistic time. The idea of educating women was seen to be detrimental to the woman's brain. It would undo their health, and it would also make them unfit for marriage. Fortunately, things have dramatically changed from these pretty patriarchal times. But college doors did begin opening to women in the 1820s. Here are a couple examples of where women were first able to go and get their college education. Prison reform. Conditions in prisons were pretty terrible. These are, unwashed cells with people eating the barest number of calories every day to stay alive. Many people packed into small areas. It's just not a good situation to find oneself in. The idea of prisons starts to evolve during the Second Great Awakening as a place, instead of it being a place for punishment, it starts to be seen as a place for reform. This is where you get terms like reformatories, house of corrections, and penitentiaries. Penitentiaries is derived from the root word penance, where individuals in society who have strayed and broke the law would go to these penitentiaries, serve their time, pay their penance, and then be able to re-enter society. Dorothy Dix, one of the leading female activists during this time period, she's going to travel over 60,000 miles in 8 years, recording her observations of prisons and insane asylums. And then using her own eyewitness accounts, she's going to petition for the Massachusetts government and then eventually other governments to reform and fund better prisons to help people be rehabilitated and enter society. The temperance movement. The temperance movement refers to alcohol consumption. The temperance movement before the American Civil War is, and also after the American Civil War, is not focused on prohibition. We may be more familiar with prohibition from the 20th century, the absolute banning of the selling, production, and consuming of alcohol. Temperance is more about just finding a happy middle ground. Alcohol consumption stereotypically back then was excessively high. There are a variety of factors for this. It's not just that old-timey people used to walk around getting smashed every day. Some of the factors may include the idea that water, for the most part, was still pretty unhealthy to drink. I think this is still before germ theory. And so people would routinely put alcohol, typically like whiskey or rum, in their water to help clean the water, let the alcohol kill off any of the bacteria that would make people sick, and that was healthier. So alcohol consumption was more normal. People worked really hard, especially out in the frontiers. And this is a time before we have, we don't have ibuprofen, we don't have painkillers, we don't have chiropractors, we don't have, muscle wraps. So people were sore and uncomfortable all the time. And so many people did turn to alcohol to help numb the pain, in the way that nowadays, if you exercise too hard, you might have an ibuprofen before you go to bed, or you might have some icy hot for your sore muscles. Well, back then they would just drink, and that would help with the suffering that they were going through. Unfortunately, some people took alcohol consumption too far, which then would endanger the families. And this is going to be a key bit of this reform movement, that if this is typically working men, if these men are consuming too much alcohol and then becoming a danger to their families and their wives and their children, then women during this time, using the idea of the cult of domesticity, which I have broken down over here in my fantastic complex sentence, the cult of domesticity, a 19th century cultural creed that honored the domestic role of women, gave women the moral authority to reform factors that negatively impacted the children and households. So what we're saying here is that the cult of domesticity, this is the idea similar to Republican motherhood, that because women are at home, they have certain roles and responsibility. Think about the 3 C's, like cooking, cleaning, and childcare. And that women, in order to protect the children and raise good Republican children, they need to have the authority to push certain social movements, these reform movements in particular, such as the temperance movement. The American Temperance Society is going to be formed during this time. And again, we're not talking about the elimination of alcohol, but rather the temperance of alcohol, and trying to find that middle ground where, yes, you can have some alcohol, but please don't get blackout drunk every night. So during this time period, at the beginning of the 19th century, women were still the submerged sex, or the subservient gender. This is still a very patriarchal time period. Women could not vote, much like black slaves. Women could be legally beaten by their overlord or their husband with a reasonable instrument. One of the jokes is that the rule of thumb phrase comes from because you could beat a husband could beat his wife with a rod, so long as the rod is no bigger than their thumb, and that was legal, much like slave owners could beat their slaves without legal repercussions. When women did marry, she was not allowed to retain the title to her property, and all of her property rights went to her husband. So for the most part, the role of women in society is relatively unchanged. They are subservient. They are reliant on marrying husbands in order to have an economic future and take care of their families. The Industrial Revolution is going to start to introduce some cracks into that social norm, which we will be exploring decent amount here during this unit. Women were seen as artistic and refined, though physically and emotionally weaker than men. They were endowed with certain moral sensibility. So again, think of your Republican motherhood, that the mother was supposed to be this maternal goddess who would raise the children, teach them to be good voting members of society and to be productive members of society, that they were entrusted with this responsibility, much like the cult of domesticity. So while the cult of domesticity and Republican motherhood each address different things, Republican motherhood talking about raising children to be good Republican members of society, saying Republicans in like the Republic, not the Republican Party. The cult of domesticity leans more heavily on women using that idea of Republican motherhood to push certain agendas. Men were considered to be strong but crude, prone to slipping into savage way of life without the guidance of a loving lady, and like to, poke fun at Disney every once in a while because I can. But if you think of Beauty and the Beast or Tarzan, both have, a more knuckle-dragging, drooling man who's very strong and very agile, kind of like a noble savage, noble beast, but it really takes the loving hand of a refined woman to kind of bring that man back into civilization. And that's kind of the dominant theme in regards to gender relations during this time period. But like I said, the Industrial Revolution is going to start to change some of that. Women reform, mostly led by white upper-class women. Unfortunately, people typically don't listen to poor people all that often unless there's a revolution going on. And so most of the movers and shakers during the women reform movement are going to come from the upper levels of society. Up here on the slide, I'm not going to go through all of these individually, though some of them really make me giggle. For example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she insisted on leaving the phrase obey out of her marriage ceremony. Historically, and even in contemporary culture, there is a part where women vow to obey their husband, and Stan was just like, nah, I'm not going to listen to him if he's being an idiot. Let's see here. What was the other one? Lucy Stone retained her maiden name. These are also significant things because this is things that women didn't do during this time period. Amelia Bloomer is going to start rocking trousers instead of, let's just say and. Don't mind my awful spelling. She's going to be rocking a short skirt and Turkish trousers, so just pants, like the little poofy, baggy pants, rather than a dress, which is, again, going against the mainstream here. During this time period, we also get the Seneca Falls Convention. This is going to be kind of the birth of the women's suffrage movement that's going to culminate with the 19th Amendment in the 20th century, where women finally earned the right to vote. So there you go. Launch the modern women's right movement. So you can't really study gender studies without acknowledging the Seneca Falls Convention. Scientific reform. Science still sucks. Medicine still lagged behind Europe, especially here in the United States. Bleeding patients was common. This was the idea that, you have the flu. Maybe we should cut your arm and take out some of your bad blood because demons are in your blood. So that's still kind of a normal thing that people were doing back then. Maybe if you're classy, you'll use leeches because science and medicine is not that great back then. A yellow fever epidemic of 79-3 killed several thousand in Philadelphia. So we still have mass outbreaks and plagues, especially with contagious diseases. So life's not that great. Life expectancy was still dismally low. For a white person born in 1850, your average life is about 40 years. So still not super great. It's even lower for people of color, especially slaves. So still not too great. Self-prescribed patent medicine and fad diets. Some weird stuff that scientists and quack doctors were trying to push on people and get them to do to help cure their ailments. Surgery is a nightmare. We don't really have anesthesia, so if you have to, have a leg amputated or have some kind of surgery, we're just going to give you a big old glass of whiskey and then tie you down, and you're going to be conscious and screaming while they saw off your leg. So think of any, American Civil War surgeon scene from a movie, and that's pretty much what we're looking at for more extreme medical emergencies. Artistic reform. I'm not going to go in a whole lot of detail in this video about artistic reform. We can talk about this a whole lot more in class, but I'm going to try to keep this short because there's a lot of names that are going to be flashing by on the slides, and I don't feel like taking the time to address every single one. But there are some themes, some broader themes that we should acknowledge. First off, the early United States lacked original art. Most of the artistic community was based on European inspirations, whether it was French inspiration or Greco-Roman inspiration. That's where a lot of these ideas come from. So not a lot of original thought artistically. Let's see here. Puritan prejudice. So if we're talking about the Puritans from New England, they really did not appreciate art. They saw it as a sinful waste of time. So you're not going to get a whole lot of original art coming from New England, and that's going to change, of course. But in the very beginning, the United States was not set up for success to be a artistic powerhouse. Let's see here. Few wealthy elites were able and are willing to pay for portraits. Art costs money effectively, and you need to have a wealthy community in order for most art forms to really flourish and take off, unless you're talking about mass art with everybody chipping in, like going to the movies or something, but that's not really an option at this time. Following the War of 1812, the surge of nationalism is going to lead to a renewed interest in the natural American landscapes, leading to some artistic breakthroughs. Most early American literature was more practical than pleasurable. You can talk about the Federalist Papers or Common Sense or the Declaration of Independence. Those are all examples of early American literature. And there's not a whole lot of fiction going on. It's much more political, much more persuasive, and it has an agenda. But after the War of 1812, more American authors, especially the nationalist ones, start to become more mainstream. This is guys like Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote Last of the Mohicans, and William Cullen Bryant. We also have the rise of Transcendentalism. Not going to dive too deep into Transcendentalism here. I know the chapter in the textbook talks about it, and we can definitely talk about it more in class, but I'm going to try to keep this concise as possible. But bottom line up front, Transcendentalists, this was a cultural and artistic movement that the individuals prescribed to the idea that truth and knowledge transcends the senses, that instead of learning things through, vision and hearing and taste and touch and smell, the five senses that John Locke theorized that all knowledge comes from, the Transcendentalists believe more in something divine, that everyone has this inner spark that, when illuminated and lit correctly, can put them in direct contact with God. And through this connection, knowledge transcends the senses and is absorbed by the person. It's pretty high level, kind of religious mumbo jumbo stuff combined with cultural movements. But this is going to take off during the years before the American Civil War. Transcendentalists supported individualism in matters of religious society. So we're moving away from mass community, all the sheeple coming together and believing one thing, and more, you can have your own thoughts, and that's more acceptable. Transcendentalists were committed to self-reliance, self-culture, and self-discipline. These guys were pretty punk and grunge, to use some 90s examples, but back in the 19th century, they did not like authority, they did not like the man, and they often took action against the man wherever possible. Some of the more famous ones: Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. Hopefully you guys have heard of these guys from literature classes here at high school. I'm not going to have you guys read any specific texts from these. However, we will be using some of their work as examples for our practice tests in class. So you may see these names again, but anytime you see these names, you should think about Transcendentalists before the American Civil War. A couple examples here of literary reform. I'm not going to go through and list them all one by one, but we do have some more Transcendentalists. We also have a fair amount of authors focusing on topics that weren't overly mainstream for the time. For example, we're going to have some anti-slavery stuff being written, which is typically unusual. Louisa May Alcott, I always butcher that name for some reason, is going to write Little Women. It's been a book that's been made into a couple of movies that I've been forced to see thanks to my wife. Hi, Kat. And that's going to focus more on the relationship between daughters, sisters, and the mother. which again is not something that, historically speaking, was very normal for American society, at least that people wanted to read. But they're starting to change the way people perceive art. Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, some of the more popular artists coming out during this time as well. So tried to keep it under 20 minutes. I'm looking at my clock and it should be cutting it pretty close, but knock on wood, hopefully I made it. Here are 3 check on learning questions I'd like you guys to address as part of your homework assignment, just to make sure that, just to verify that you guys were paying attention during the video. First question, how did reformers justify reforming and expanding public schools? So I need you guys to connect some of the inspiration for this reform movement, maybe the Second Great Awakening, with education reform. Oh, I don't know why they all say 1. Second question. I got you. 2 and 3. 2. How did women use their influence through the cult of domesticity to lead the temperance movement? So again, I need you to connect those 2 ideas. And finally, which of the reform movements discussed in this video do you think had the largest impact on the modern United States and why? So that one's more of open-ended. We talked about a bunch. We talked about prison reform, education reform, literary reform, women's suffrage, temperance movement. Which of those do you think was the most important for us today and why? Go ahead and write me a little snippet for that one, and I can give you some points for your time. Believe that's all I have for you guys today. I'm going to go ahead and sign off, and I will see you guys in class. Email me if you have any questions. Mr. Long, over and out.